20,000 impressions later.
20 minutes later, 24 hours later, 48 hours later, a few inches later, a few minutes later, a few moments later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 8 hours later, and a flashback. Eventually, flashback. 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later.
Can you move it along? I'm all out of time cards.
2,000 years later. 2 very boring minutes later. 3 days later. 5 hours later. 5 minutes later. 7:59 a.m. 8 hours later. 10 seconds later. 15 minutes later. Later that same evening. Many hours later. Meanwhile, moments later. More moments later. Much later. Much later. Much later. 1 eternity later.
1 hour later!
1 pair of pants later. 1 week later. Several days later. Several song-filled hours later. Soon after. The following day. The following Thursday. Yesterday. 2,000 years later. 6.5 hours later. A few inches later. Day 2. Day 3. Day 4. A few moments later. 1 eternity later. 3 days later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later. While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up. Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. The next day, later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later,
70 years later.
meanwhile, 6 hours later, the party is shaping up, and a flashback soon after montage. Yesterday, meanwhile, back in the Lola. A few moments later, more moments later, later, in the void, much later, much later, the following Thursday, later that same evening, just then, by sheer coincidence, 12 o'clock midnight, 3:28 a.m., 7:59 a.m., 8:01 p.m., 10 seconds later, 12 seconds later, 1 minute, 37 seconds later, same evening, several days later, 6 months later, 2 hours later, 1 minute, 37 seconds later, 1 debt to society later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 1 pair of pants later, 8 hours later, 298 frozen patties later, 3 hours later, epilogue. The next day, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab, 3 days later, opening night later, 3,000 years later, 1 week later, 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later, the following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue. Several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later. Yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, one extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Meanwhile, back in the lowland, 1 frozen wasteland later, 2 very boring minutes later, 5 minutes later, 5 minutes later, 11 minutes later, 15 minutes later, 20 minutes later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later.
1 hour later!
1 hour later, 1 hour later, 1 hour later, 2 hours 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 later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 3 hours later, 5 hours later, 346 minutes later, 6 hours later, 6 hours later, 6.5 hours later, 7 hours later, 8 hours later, 8 hours later, approximately 10 hours later, several song-filled hours later, many hours later, many unbearable hours later, marrow for sure, 24 hours later, 24 hours later, early the next morning, 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 the next day, the next day, the next day, the following day, tomorrow, the very next evening, day 2, 48 hours later, 2 days later, day 3, 72 hours later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, 3 days later, day 4, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later, several days later, 1 week later, 1 week later, 2 weeks later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 3 weeks later, 3 weeks later, 4 to 6 weeks later, 6 months later, several months later, 3 months later, 75 years later, 2,000 years later, 3,000 years later, 1 eternity later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab opening night, a lot of boring math later, many tic-tacs later, 1 semester later, 1 debt to society later, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 long angry line later, 1 shift later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 1 winner later, 1 pair of pants later, 298 frozen patties later, thousands of tears later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, 2 days later, later in the void, approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later, 72 hours later, 2 hours later, just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage, the next morning, many tic-tacs later, flashback, and a flashback, 3,000 whoop-whoos later,
80,000 impressions later.
would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. A few inches later, eventually, several bad puns later. Graduation day. Epilogue. Epilogue. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. The very next evening, 1 hour later. The next day, later, 4 to 6 days later, 4 to 6 more days later. The next morning, moments later. More moments later. 1 semester later. Graduation day.
1 hour later!
80,000 impressions later.
Would you please stop imitating me? It is starting to get very annoying. 3,000 whoop-whoos later. Soon after. Later. Moments later. Later. The next morning. Many unbearable hours later. 12 seconds later. 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later. Many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow. Tomorrow for sure. Eventually. 12 o'clock midnight. 2 hours later. Meanwhile. 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later. 20 minutes later. 6 hours later. Several bad puns later. 1 hour later. 2 hours later. 3 hours later.